In the summer of 2022, the world was distracted by routine headlines, trade disputes, energy price fluctuations, and political scandals. But somewhere off the mainstream radar, a voice that had long warned of unseen currents and secret histories grew louder. David Wilcock, an author, speaker, and self-described seer, had been quietly observing the tectonic shifts in world power. And he had a warning. January 26, 2026 would not be just another date. It would mark the start of a crisis that could ripple across nations, starting with the Americas. Wilcock's followers had come to expect bold predictions, often couched in scientific and mystical terms. Yet what he described in private seminars and later in carefully released video recordings was different. He spoke of a leader who believed the world could be bent to his will, a nation rich in oil but fragile in alliances, and a neighboring country whose people would not sit silently while decisions were made over their heads. To those familiar with the prophecy, the message was unmistakable. The United States, under the shadow of one powerful figure, would collide with Venezuela, and the tensions would be impossible to ignore. Colombia, though silent for now, would be drawn inevitably into the unfolding drama. In interviews with select podcasts in late 2023, Wilcock refused to reveal names outright. He preferred symbols. The energy of a nation, he told one host, cannot be manipulated without consequence. When one man tries to bend it, others will push back. Watch the date. Watch the alliances. January 26th is when the current will break. At the time, listeners dismissed it as cryptic rhetoric. Yet Wilcock's track record gave pause. For decades, he had made predictions about political shifts, technological revelations, and social upheavals. Some eerily accurate, some uncomfortably close to reality. The prophecy was recorded in a video diary, locked away in a private vault until Wilcock deemed it ready for public attention. The footage shows him sitting in a modest office lined with books and artifacts, a map of the Western Hemisphere on one wall, and charts depicting oil and energy flows on the other. His eyes, calm but piercing, convey certainty. The United States and Venezuela, he said, voice low, deliberate, will face a test. The world will watch, and few will understand the reasons at first. One man believes he can control the outcome, but nature, politics, and the will of the people cannot be ignored. He tapped the calendar on his desk, highlighting January 26, 2026. Mark it. This is when the first domino falls. Behind the scenes, Wilcock had been studying patterns of diplomacy, military readiness, and historical analogs. He noted that Venezuela, under its current leadership, a fictionalized president we will call President Mateo Alvarez for narrative clarity, was not simply a passive player. The country's government, while facing economic pressure, had cultivated a web of regional alliances and strong popular sentiment. Any overt action by an outside power, particularly the United States, would trigger responses that no military strategy alone could predict. Wilcock's prediction was not only mystical, it was informed by careful observation and a deep understanding of geopolitics. The first public hint of this prophecy came during a private webinar in late 2024, released online under the title The America's Hidden Currents. Wilcock spoke to an audience of analysts, historians, and curious citizens. He described a moment when the unexpected will challenge the expected, when old alliances fray and new tensions ignite. He warned that leaders who believe the world bends to their image may be blindsided by the consequences. Though no one in the room fully grasped the scale of his warning, those familiar with his work recognized a pattern. A date was being set, a stage prepared, and the focus was on Venezuela, the United States, and the broader hemisphere. Wilcock's vision, however, did not occur in isolation. In early 2025, as the world watched Venezuela grapple with inflation, energy shortages, and political maneuvering, Subtle shifts began to align with the prophecy. Diplomatic cables leaked in narrative fiction suggested that Colombian leadership had quietly expressed concern over potential U.S. intervention. Meanwhile, U.S. political advisors debated energy security, regional influence, and the optics of military engagement. All signs, Wilcock insisted, were moving toward a climax, and the calendar marked January 26, 2026. Artfully, Wilcock framed the prophecy as a moral lesson rather than a political judgment. He avoided direct accusations, focusing instead on cause and effect, energy flows, and human reactions. "Do not look at this as right or wrong," he told one online audience. "Look at it as inevitable. Given the choices of leaders and the actions of nations, the people of Venezuela, Colombia, and the United States will all play roles, knowingly or unknowingly. The date is a fulcrum." By mid-2025, anticipation among followers grew. Analysts who studied Wilcock's past predictions noted his uncanny ability to connect seemingly minor political events with larger global shifts. What made this prophecy particularly resonant was its specificity. A date, regional actors, and a central figure reminiscent of real political leaders. Yet it was couched in ambiguity enough to avoid outright defamation, preserving the aura of mystery while capturing attention. As January 2026 approached, social media buzzed with speculation. Forum threads debated the likelihood of a U.S.-Venezuelan confrontation, referencing Wilcock's prophecy. Political commentators debated whether this was a cautionary tale, a predictive insight, or simply a viral marketing phenomenon. Wilcock himself remained calm, repeating the mantra he had used for decades. Prediction is not control. Foreknowledge is preparation. The first block concludes with a reflection on how prophecy, politics, and public perception intersect. Wilcock's words, recorded years before the events of 2026, now carry the weight of anticipation. Whether one believes in mystical insight or sees it as strategic foresight, the narrative establishes a tension that will dominate the hemisphere. The United States, Venezuela, Colombia, and the world watch, unknowingly participating in a drama scripted by history, human ambition, and the prophetic eye of David Wilcock. January 26, 2026 is no longer just a date. It is a moment when the hidden currents of power, influence, and destiny will collide. By early January 2026, the weight of David Wilcock's prophecy had begun to seep into the consciousness of those following global events. The United States was watching Venezuela with unusual intensity. Trade disputes, energy shipments, and political posturing had always existed, but now analysts framed every action through a lens of prophetic inevitability. The public, influenced by social media speculation and talk show debates, began to wonder, could a mystical prediction from years ago dictate the future of nations? In Wilcock's original notes, carefully transcribed by his closest followers, the prophecy contained layers of symbolism. He had warned of a short, sharp war and a tower sign. Political insiders debated what that could mean. Was the tower literal or metaphorical? Some argued it referred to skyscrapers in Washington, a symbol of concentrated power. Others speculated it pointed to oil rigs, telecommunications towers, or even an abstract signal of American leadership under strain. Regardless of interpretation, the effect was immediate. National security teams began to scrutinize every connection between Washington, Caracas, and Bogota. President Mateo Alvarez of Venezuela, though unaware of the prophecy, sensed the growing pressure. In this fictional narrative, Alvarez had cultivated influence over neighboring Colombia to create a buffer against foreign interference. The Colombian government, balancing between economic pragmatism and popular sentiment, faced internal dissent. Citizens and local militias feared U.S. intervention, while business leaders urged diplomacy. The short, sharp war Wilcock mentioned was now more than a mystical warning. It became a framework for interpreting real-time events. In Washington, President Trump, fictionalized in the narrative for storytelling, received daily briefings on the region. Military analysts presented maps with supply lines, naval routes, and troop deployments. Every decision was weighed not just against geopolitical strategy, but against public perception. Meanwhile, Wilcox's prophecy circulated among political aides in cryptic forums and internal memos. The phrase, "he will overreach," began to echo in private discussions. The sense of urgency was heightened because the prophecy had named a date, January 26, 2026. Wilcox's followers studied his past predictions for context. They pointed to his warnings about global conflicts, sudden political upheavals, and energy crises. Each pattern suggested that while the prophecy was framed in mystical language, it followed real-world logic. Leaders who miscalculate the reaction of other nations risk escalation. In the narrative, Wilcox's insight functions as a combination of intuition, historical analysis, and keen observation of human behavior. To Americans tuning into news reports, the story seemed like unfolding fiction. Yet in Wilcox's universe, the pieces fell into place with unnerving clarity. A U.S. delegation's visit to Colombia, ostensibly for economic talks, became a prelude to a regional confrontation. Venezuela mobilized a limited defensive posture, sending supplies and advisors to border areas. Trump's advisors debated the optics of intervention versus diplomacy, while the general public speculated wildly online about the prophecy's implications. Symbolism, Wilcox insisted, was the key to understanding the event. The tower sign could be a marker for leadership visibility, public appearances, press briefings, or even satellite-tracked movements. The short, sharp war was not necessarily a full-scale conflict, but a rapid escalation of pressure, sanctions, cyber attacks, or demonstrations designed to test the resolve of both governments. Every action, every misstep, could act as a spark. Behind closed doors, Trump's fictional advisors modeled scenarios. They simulated Venezuelan resistance, Colombian mediation, and international reactions from Russia, China, and the United Nations. Wilcox's prediction added psychological pressure. Not only did it suggest a geopolitical crisis, but it also implied that misreading the date or symbolic markers could lead to disaster. The prophecy became a self-fulfilling lens through which strategy was considered. The narrative introduces moments of personal tension. Trump, in this alternate history, is portrayed as a man aware of public perception and the mystical prophecy alike. He reads media reports, hears the whispers in political circles, and contemplates whether Wilcox is merely entertaining or if he truly glimpsed a future consequence of his own decisions. For Venezuelan President Alvarez, the prophecy is unknown, yet the international scrutiny it inspires forces him into defensive diplomacy, constrained by economic realities and popular sentiment. Wilcox's followers broadcast clips online, dissecting his words. He will overreach. The people of Venezuela and Colombia will respond. And January 26th will mark the first significant shift. Each fragment is analyzed in real time by amateur geopolitical analysts and professional observers alike. A sense of inevitability spreads, blending prophecy with news headlines, merging mystical forewarning with contemporary politics. The block concludes by emphasizing the stakes. This is no longer merely a prediction for the mystics. It is a framework for understanding international events. Wilcox's words, decades in the making, resonate with Americans witnessing the rise of tension in the Americas. By January 26, 2026, the world watches, consciously or unconsciously following the script laid out by history, ambition, and prophecy. The United States, Venezuela, and Colombia are caught in a web where strategy and fate intermingle. By mid-January 2026, the pressure in Washington had become palpable. Advisors crowded the Situation Room, maps sprawled across tables, satellite feeds glowing from every screen. Every headline about Venezuela or Colombia was scrutinized through a dual lens. intelligence, and prophecy. David Wilcock's prediction was no longer just whispered in mystical forums, it had entered mainstream discourse, amplified by late-night shows, YouTube commentators, and political analysts. The countdown to January 26th dominated every conversation in strategic circles. President Trump, in this fictional narrative, was unusually focused. His normally flamboyant demeanor gave way to a restrained intensity, his signature gestures replaced by thoughtful pacing. Briefings were longer, questions sharper. Advisors warned that public panic over the prophecy could be as dangerous as the real-world situation. Any misstep could trigger a diplomatic incident or domestic unrest. Trump, aware of the prophecy's followers watching his every move, needed to project authority without appearing reactionary. Meanwhile, in Caracas, President Mateo Alvarez sensed the mounting tension, but maintained his characteristic calm. Publicly, he reassured citizens that Venezuela's borders and sovereignty were secure. Privately, he coordinated with military strategists and regional allies, aware that Colombia was under pressure to act as a mediator, but also wary of being drawn into a conflict not of its making. The short, sharp war, Wilcock foresaw, was manifesting less as combat and more as a series of rapid, high-stakes political maneuvers. The narrative emphasizes the psychological impact of prophecy on decision-making. Advisors in Washington debated the implications of the tower sign, speculating whether it referred to the visibility of leadership, the concentration of resources, or a symbolic warning of overreach. Analysts in Caracas and Bogotá began to notice unusual U.S. troop movements, shipping activity, and communication surveillance, each action interpreted as confirmation of the prophecy. The tension escalated not because of inevitable war, but because every leader feared being perceived as the first to misstep. As January 20th approached, intelligence reports indicated unusual activity at Venezuelan border checkpoints and Colombian military posts. Drone flights monitored potential supply routes. Naval vessels adjusted positions along the Caribbean coast. Each move was dissected by both regional and American observers. The prophecy lent a sense of urgency that had been absent in previous months, pushing governments into rapid response planning. Every contingency, from limited skirmishes to cyber attacks, was rehearsed with meticulous precision. The American public, captivated by media coverage, became a secondary actor in the drama. Wilcock's followers highlighted patterns and interpreted minor incidents as signs of prophecy in motion. Tweets, forums, and streaming commentary created a feedback loop. Leaders acted cautiously because the world expected them to, and the world expected them to act because of the prophecy. Public anxiety and fascination created a climate where diplomacy was inseparable from the story of destiny. In Washington, Trump's strategy combined pressure and restraint. Military advisors recommended demonstrating capability while avoiding provocation. Sanctions were considered alongside overt threats of naval presence. Political operatives debated messaging, how to reassure the domestic audience without escalating fear internationally. Each decision reflected the dual reality imposed by prophecy. Practical geopolitics and symbolic destiny intertwined, shaping behavior before events even unfolded. In Caracas, Alvarez anticipated these actions. He strengthened defensive measures, coordinated with regional allies, and leveraged international organizations to assert Venezuela's sovereignty. Every diplomatic message was crafted to balance firmness with openness to negotiation. Colombia, caught between economic dependency and regional stability, played a cautious role, mediating where possible, preparing contingency plans where necessary. The short, sharp war began to take shape as a high-stakes game of maneuvering, each side responding to both perceived threats and the shadow of prophecy. January 26th arrived, the date David Wilcock had highlighted years earlier. Media coverage intensified, framing the day as a turning point. In Washington, Caracas, and Bogotá, leaders were awake before dawn, reviewing intelligence, reassessing plans, and monitoring communications. The world watched, some skeptically, others with a sense of awe at the seeming fulfillment of mystical foresight. The prophecy, originally dismissed as speculative, now acted as a psychological accelerator, sharpening decisions and amplifying consequences. By midday, subtle but decisive actions had begun. The U.S. implemented strategic positioning of naval assets near the Caribbean, signaling readiness without direct aggression. Venezuela conducted coordinated exercises near border areas, demonstrating defense capability. Colombia, mediating quietly, facilitated communication channels to prevent accidental escalation. Analysts described it as a bloodless test of wills, a rapid, high-stakes demonstration that confirmed the prophecy's core warning. Miscalculation could ignite conflict instantly. The bloc highlights personal stakes as well. Advisors and regional leaders experienced stress akin to soldiers on a battlefield, despite the absence of direct combat. Political calculations were informed not just by strategy but by a cultural awareness of prophecy, the sense that history, destiny, and individual decisions were converging on this single day. The tension created a palpable energy in every decision room, every press briefing, every border post. As evening fell, commentators remarked on the apparent restraint exercised by all parties. While movements and maneuvers reflected Wilcox's predictions, the conflict remained symbolic rather than kinetic. The short, sharp war had not manifested as violence, but the warning functioned. Leaders understood the stakes, citizens followed the drama, and the prophecy itself gained credibility. It had shaped behavior and tested judgment, fulfilling its narrative purpose without a single shot being fired. The bloc concludes with reflection. Prophecy, in this alternative history, was more than prediction. It was a lens through which global politics was interpreted, a force shaping perception and behavior. Trump, Alvarez, and Colombian officials acted cautiously because the world expected prophecy to manifest. David Wilcox's foresight, interpreted symbolically and operationally, had orchestrated a test of leadership, diplomacy, and national resolve. By the end of January 26, 2026, the world realized that conflict was narrowly avoided, but only because every leader had acted as if the prophecy were true. The delicate balance remained fragile, a reminder that destiny, perception, and decision-making are inseparable in the modern geopolitical arena. The sun set on January 26, 2026, and the world exhaled in unison. The day had arrived exactly as John Edward had foretold years before, yet no physical conflict erupted. Instead, the tension itself became the story, a testament to the power of prophecy in shaping human behavior. In Washington, President Trump returned to the White House from the Situation Room, the weight of the day etched into his posture. Advisors noted a rare silence in the corridors, a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Across the Caribbean, President Mateo Alvarez of Venezuela reviewed reports from the border. The country had remained calm, though prepared for escalation that never came. His officers understood that the prophecy had been a catalyst, not a literal battle. By responding decisively but cautiously, Alvarez had preserved both national sovereignty and regional stability. Meanwhile, Colombian officials quietly celebrated the success of their mediation efforts, recognizing the delicate balance they had maintained between two superpowers without triggering a confrontation. The American public, glued to news outlets and social media, digested the unfolding aftermath. John Edwards' prediction, once relegated to late-night segments in spiritualist communities, now dominated mainstream discussion. Headlines read, "Prophecy or Policy? How a Psychic Shaped the Day's Diplomacy." And news commentators debated whether Edwards' foresight had influenced political decisions, or merely mirrored actions that leaders were already prepared to take. Memes flooded platforms, blending the mystique of prophecy with real-time political analysis. The narrative emphasizes the psychological impact of prophecy on governance. Every leader involved had acted with the awareness that the world, and particularly their domestic audiences, was watching for signs of fulfillment. This awareness amplified caution, accelerated diplomacy, and constrained rash decisions. In essence, the prophecy had functioned as a non-violent accelerant, compressing weeks of potential conflict into a single day's high-stakes maneuvering. In Washington, Trump addressed the nation in a rare evening broadcast. He spoke carefully, referencing regional tensions without acknowledging the prophecy explicitly. Yet the careful phrasing, the pointed mentions of Venezuela and Colombia, and the visual cues of maps and strategic diagrams reinforced the narrative Edward had provided. For millions of Americans, the broadcast confirmed what they had seen unfolding. The president had acted as though destiny itself was observing, and by doing so, avoided catastrophe. Simultaneously, international analysts and political historians began to reinterpret January 26th. Some described it as the day prophecy met policy, where spiritual foresight intersected with geopolitics to prevent escalation. Others were skeptical, attributing outcomes to conventional intelligence, diplomacy, and luck. Yet the persistence of Edward's prediction in media coverage ensured that it would be remembered as a defining narrative of the 2020s. The story delves into the symbolic dimension of prophecy, Trump's aggressive posturing, Alvarez's measured defense, and Colombia's quiet mediation were all magnified by the awareness of destiny in motion. Each decision was now read through two lenses: practical consequence and prophetic validation. Leaders and citizens alike recognized that human perception can amplify outcomes as effectively as military action. John Edward himself appeared on television later that evening, silhouette against a backdrop of celestial imagery. His calm voice narrated the events of the day, linking them to earlier predictions and emphasizing the subtlety of prophecy. It was never about dictating events, but about shaping awareness and choices. His message resonated particularly strongly in the United States, where the blending of politics, spirituality, and media had created a unique cultural phenomenon. The block also highlights the human element. Advisors, diplomats, and military planners experienced a mixture of awe, skepticism, and professional reflection. Many admitted privately that Edward's prediction had shaped their decision-making, if only by heightening caution and awareness. In Caracas, Alvarez's team acknowledged the psychological pressure of being part of a global narrative that had cosmic overtones. In Bogotá, Colombian officials took note of the unexpected influence of a psychic's warning on regional stability. By nightfall, social media exploded with reactions. Analysts debated whether Trump had deliberately aligned his actions with Edward's prophecy, or whether coincidence and careful strategy had made it appear so. Podcasts, streaming shows, and news networks dissected every movement, from naval deployments to diplomatic statements. The prophecy, once niche, had become part of national conversation, an emblem of how belief and politics can intersect in modern America. The narrative also explores legacy. For Trump, the day reinforced his image as a decisive leader, capable of navigating crises under intense scrutiny. For Alvarez, it validated cautious diplomacy as an effective tool against potential aggression. For the American public, it highlighted how awareness of possibility, whether through intelligence, analysis, or prophetic insight, can prevent disasters. For John Edward, the day cemented his reputation as a psychic whose influence reached beyond entertainment into the domain of global decision-making. Finally, the block closes with reflection on uncertainty and human choice. January 26, 2026 had unfolded without direct conflict, but the world had glimpsed the fragile thread between prediction and action. Prophecy, in this story, was not about absolute certainty, but about shaping perception, heightening responsibility, and demonstrating how belief even in the supernatural can influence outcomes in tangible ways. Leaders, citizens, and viewers alike were reminded that destiny, while mysterious, is often navigated in the intersection of awareness, choice, and courage. The narrator ends with a thought-provoking note. The events predicted and partially influenced by John Edward were only the beginning. Future conflicts, alliances, and decisions would continue to unfold in a world where perception and prophecy increasingly shape reality. For the audience, the story leaves an uneasy awareness. Some warnings come not from maps or intelligence reports, but from visions of what might be, whispered years before and realized in the hands of those who dared to heed them.